This is chess, a game between two armies on an 8x8 board and two very delicate kings. If a king gets captured, the game ends. This means the king is the most valuable piece, but chess has a few more pieces, so let's start from the beginning. You see this row here? This row belongs to the main line of attack. These are the pawns. A pawn is like an intern that just started the game and it's at the mercy of the higher valued pieces. A pawn is worth 1 point and can only move forward and can only capture a piece that is one square diagonally forward, to the left, or right. A pawn can only move diagonally when there is a piece to capture, otherwise it's limited to only forward. If another piece is blocking the path forward, then the pawn is just stuck. Even though it's the least valuable piece, the pawn has two cool abilities. The first one is that it can advance 2 squares forward on the first move. After that, a pawn is limited to only 1 square per move. And as an intern, the pawn's second ability is to promote into any piece they like if they manage to breach the enemy defenses. Or more precisely, if they reach the last row. Now we move to higher valued pieces. The bishops and the knights here are worth 3 points each, and while they have the same value, they are played very differently. Imagine the bishop as an archer that sits across the field and snipes the enemy. A bishop can move diagonally back and forth across the whole board, but if an obstacle is on their way, then they cannot move past it. But if it is an enemy piece, then they can just take it. Very powerful. That is why the devs needed to nerf it a bit. You see, we have 2 bishops in the game, the white squared bishop and the black squared bishop. Both of these pieces can never move to a different color other than the one they start on. The knights, on the other hand, have a lot more freedom. Think of knights as guys who master the art of yoga and are constantly moving in an unpredictable L shape. Knights move 2 squares in straight pathways, and then take a left or a right. Compared to other pieces, knights have a cool ability that can move to a free square they want, even if something blocks a square along the way. But if a piece is blocking the destination, then the knights also have the same restriction, meaning they can take the piece or move to a different square. There are 2 more pieces you need to learn, the rooks and the queen, which are considered major pieces. The rooks are worth 5 points each, and they're like enemy tanks marching into the battlefield after the other pieces have ruined each other. A rook can move up and down, or side to side, for as many squares as they want. But they are still not the most valuable piece. Instead, it's the queen, worth 9 points. The queen moves like a combination of the rook and the bishop, meaning it can move left, right, top, bottom, and diagonally. Unlike bishops, the queen is not limited to the original square color, and unlike the rook, it can deal with diagonal threats way better. But the devs thought about it, and that is why they gave the same restriction to the queen and the rook, meaning if they are blocked, they can take the piece or move to a different square, but they cannot go past it. Now it's time to explain the king, the most important piece in chess. The king can move 1 square in any direction to escape, attack, or defend pieces. But the king has like one insane nerf. If a king is threatened, all the other pieces cannot move unless they defend the king. If the pieces are defending the king, then they cannot move out of the way since the king would get exposed and the game would end. Normally the devs thought about this and made it illegal for the king to sabotage. Meaning even if the king can move freely, it cannot expose himself to a square covered by the enemy pieces. The king can move out of the way or get protected by its pieces, but when there is no option left for him, that's when the game ends. Whoever captures the enemy king wins the game. But kings also know how to cheat the system a little bit. If there are no other pieces that can move, and the king is not threatened but has no possible safe options to move in, then the game ends in a draw. The devs, however, wanted to balance things a bit. I mean, the king should have a way to protect himself instead of just being in front of the center all the time. Introducing castling, the only move in chess where 2 pieces move at the same time. Castling is simple. The king moves 2 squares to the left or right, and the rook follows on the other side of the king. If the rook is closer, then we call it kingside castle. If the rook is further away, then it's called queenside castle. If you have trouble memorizing all this, just remember that the king only moves 2 squares and the rook follows. What you do have to worry about, though, are the castling rules, because the opponent will try to abuse them. Here are the rules. The spaces between the king and the rook must be empty. The king cannot be in check, and the squares where the king passes and lands should not be threatened by enemy pieces. The rook and the king can only castle if both have not moved from their starting square. If one of the pieces move and go back to their square, it still does not count because it's only the first move that allows castling. Kind of like the double jump we mentioned for the pawns. But since we are talking about pawns, there is one last rule you need to know. By introducing castling, the king becomes a bit too protected. After all, he can just castle and block the game using pawns. So, the devs had to create a way for pawns to stop the double jump. If a pawn is to the left or right of the double jump, then that pawn can cut diagonally as if the pawn only moved one square. Now that you have learned how pieces move, it's time to really understand the game. Try to think of chess as a coverage game, meaning you try to cover more squares than your opponent. Here, take this position for example. Who do you think is winning? Normally the side with the higher points has the advantage, but let's look at the square coverage. The white side has these surrounding squares covered by the king, and these two diagonal squares are covered by the pawn. Let's compare it to the opponent. The black king covers its surrounding squares, and the queen covers up, right, down, left, and the diagonals. But the queen still doesn't threaten anything since it doesn't cover any squares where the white pieces are located. Now let's assume it's black to move. The queen goes to the diagonal on her left, and if we look at the coverage again, on her left side, the queen checks the king, and on top of her, she attacks the pawn. The white king has no choice but to move and pass the turn to the opponent. The black queen is then free to take the pawn. So, coverage of the pieces is not only what it reaches in the moment, but also what it has the potential to do. The true potential of chess pieces is how they cover areas together in their attack or defense. Let's examine the attack first. We have the same position, but we make it slightly more complicated with a bishop and a knight. Black is still winning, but this time we can't just attack the king and take the pawn like we did last time, because it's covered by the bishop, and the bishop is protected by the king. So, what do? Well, we tried to combine covered areas in our attack. Currently, the knight is not doing anything here, so we move the knight here, attacking the pawn. White cannot move the pawn since it would immediately escape the bishop's coverage, and the queen would have an easy time grabbing it in the future. So, the other option is to just stall with the movement of the king or the bishops. White goes back with the king. The black queen moves diagonally again, and once again we see that the coverage of the queen has two targets. This is how chess pieces attack, by creating common coverage where they can attack pieces. Now we know that we need to take that pawn, so how do we do it? You most likely answered with the knight, and you would be right, because choosing what piece to trade goes back to the values for each piece. It wouldn't make sense to sacrifice the queen, which is worth 9 points, for a pawn and a bishop, which are worth 4 points total. Taking with the knight, on the other hand, means you sacrifice 3 points of your own to take away 4 points of material from your opponent. Good job! You learned how to attack efficiently in chess, but now you need to learn how to defend your pieces using everything you have learned so far. In theory, attacking and defending should be pretty much the same, but it's often way harder for a beginner to defend efficiently against enemy attacks. This happens thanks to a thing we call tunnel vision. It's funny, but when a beginner starts chess, they actually profit a bit from tunnel vision when it comes to attacking. Since they can't see the opponent's defenses very well, they just proceed with their plan, and sometimes that just works. Even if we put luck out of the way, it's just generally way easier to attack in chess, because you can only focus on a few pieces at a time. But for defense, you really need to examine the board more, since you might have many options for defending, but not all of them are good. Take this position for example. A beginner would see the white bishop attacking the black bishop and would start panicking. I mean, surely this is a big threat because the bishop here is very close to the king. So, what's the correct way to defend? Well, let's examine. Option 1 is to attack the bishop before it attacks us. That would eliminate the bishop, but the queen here would just take our piece and pose as an even more dangerous threat. Option 2 is to just leave it and develop other pieces like this white squared bishop here. If you picked option 2, you would be right. The king is not in danger. He might seem a bit surrounded, but what's the worst thing that can happen? Pieces of the same value get traded, and the king moves in a square that can be checked diagonally, but since the black squared bishop is gone, you don't really have to worry that much anymore. Only the queen can check you on that square, but the opponent would first have to develop his other pieces so he can afford to attack with the queen. But what if you picked option 1? Well, that could turn into a game-ending mistake very fast. After the trading of pieces, the queen is very close to checkmating the king. All it needs is a piece that it can work with in its attack. If after this, you decide to develop the bishop like last time, thinking you still have a lot of time, then the opponent will move the knight here, and now the game is over. Both the queen and the knight attack this pawn here, and the king has nowhere to go. Even if it was not blocked by its own pieces, the knight would cover these two squares and the queen would cover these other two, which obviously is very bad news. But now it's checkmate. There is nothing black can do to stop the queen in time, but it could have done something on the previous move. Let's assume you made a mistake and allowed the queen to move. Now you have to keep defending a non-favorable position. A chess game most of the time is not about just one mistake. Instead, it's a collection of moves that give or take advantage of the position. Sure, you messed up the previous move, but now you can just compensate by making your pawn structure a bit vulnerable to stop the knight from closing in. You can even push the queen out with your own queen if the opponent plays passively. The point is that chess is a back and forth game until the final mistake. Now that you know how to defend and attack, it's time to learn openings and mid-game. There are like 1,000 openings in chess, but only 20 of them are really popular. You can try out different openings and gambits, but for now, let's focus on an opening called the Sicilian defense. It starts like this. Your opponent moves pawn to e4. That pawn now covers the center of the board. You respond with pawn to c5. Now you cover these two squares. The opponent follows with the knight to f3, and then you reply with knight to c6. Both the knight and pawn cover this square, which for chess is very important since that's the center. So white normally does not want you to keep adding into that square, so they push the pawn to d4, attacking the pawn. You, on the other hand, are happy to exchange pawns here. Sure, you lose a piece of the center, but you are forcing white into a more open position that is focused on attack, while yours is a bit more closed and is focused on defense. Which explains the name Sicilian defense here, but really there are a lot of variations on how you can play this opening. But since we want to keep things closed, the next move is knight to f6. White follows with the knight out, and then you reply with pawn to d6. You are taking up more space but still keeping everything compact. White replies with bishop to c4, and you then block its path with a defending move, pawn to e6. Next, both pieces move out the bishops to protect the knights and open the way for kings to castle. White moves the queen e2, and finally black castles kingside and white castles queenside. This is the opening, but we have to analyze it a bit before we move on to midgame. Basically, an opening is just a way to send out your pieces and take as much space as you can without compromising your position. Look at the coverage for white. It pretty much covers all of the center, and the pieces that are threatened are defended. The knight here is defended by the bishop and the rook, the pawn defended by the knight. Now let's look at the black side. Once again, the coverage is great. Not as much as white, but it is way easier to manage. After all, white has no clear attacking path with all that pawn structure. So you don't need to learn many openings or even none at all, but you do have to keep in mind that the center is important and your pieces have to be developed. When you develop your pieces, make sure to strike a balance between developing and protecting your king. Now you are prepared for the mid-game. Mid-game is probably the most fun part about chess. In a mid-game, your main goal is to try to break through defenses of the other side while still defending your own pieces. Here where we left on, white will try to reach the king side using these pawns. It will push these pawns forward and will try to expose the king's defenses as much as possible. Black on the other side will defend, but it will also try to attack the white king side by pushing these pawns, or by pushing the game from the center. Learning the mid-game is part of the process of becoming a better chess player, and it comes with experience, but still, let me show you a few tips that will help you a lot. The first one is trading pieces. When trading a piece in chess, of course you have to look at the value of points, but you also have to look at the position. If you want to trade a piece, you are doing so in hopes of that exchange helping you in some way. Maybe you weaken enemy defenses, or you have a plan and want to go for it. But you don't want to exchange just because you have the option. For example, let's assume black moves the pawn and white here has the option to exchange knights. After exchanging, white would soon realize he made a mistake. Black, without even trying, just made the best pawn fortress it can hope for, and the king is tucked away in safety. Black now has an easier line of taking the center and attacking the king. So, when it comes to trading pieces, you really have to pick your battles. Next is to leave the queen alone. I know this is funny to say, but you should not go full-on attack with the queen during the mid-game. Sure, the queen is the strongest piece, but it's also the most valuable piece on the whole board, so you can't risk losing it. You can use the queen if you have a really powerful line of attack, but if you don't, then that queen should instead be used to keep pieces protected and allow other pieces to break through defenses first. If you want to trade queens, that is fine too, but you have to keep in mind the first tip. The final one is to really be careful with the pawns. Pawns are like coins. Sure, you don't want to waste your time and would rather pay with a dollar bill, but when you use coins, it just feels right. It's the same with chess. The pawn is really boring, and most players would rather play with a knight or a queen. But just like life, we have to work with what is given to us. By the way, this is your reminder to use that huge pile of coins that are sitting in your wallet. Now, why are pawns so crucial? Well, that's because they are the first line of defense and attack during midgame. They also decide the game during the endgame, but for now let's go back to the Sicilian defense. Here, black has two very distinguished pawns. Black can push this pawn forward to dominate the center. White has no other choice but to move the knight. If white wants to get rid of that pawn structure, it's going to have to use other pawns or try to focus on the weak point of a pawn structure. The final tip about pawns is that they are strong when they are close to other pawns. If we have a pawn here protected only by a knight or a queen and no other pawns to the left or right, consider that pawn gone. So always be mindful of keeping those good boys together and not throwing them away carelessly. Now we can move on to the endgame. As the name suggests, an endgame is the final part of the game. That's when you check the king and leave no squares for him to escape. The most common endgame ending you're going to see is the king directly in front of the opposing king, and a rook or a queen checking him in the last row. Sometimes the king is blocked by his own pieces. Sometimes the queen just completely surrounds him, or sometimes there are two rooks blocking two rows completely. Either way, you are going to figure these out eventually. But the hard part of an endgame is getting to the point where you have a clear advantage over your opponent. A great endgame tip I have for you is to analyze 2 or 3 moves ahead in a forced variation. I'm not telling you to become a calculator, but to also see what the opponent can do when you force a move. Like, look at this position. You are obviously in a bad spot. You see that you are a rook against a knight, so the normal thought process is that you should remove the rook. That is why a beginner would play something like knight to e7. But this is what I mean when I say that you should at least calculate forcing moves as much as possible. Now the opponent has an easier idea of what to do. Move the rook, and since it looks good, maybe pin the knight to the king. That doesn't mean forcing moves are bad, but they are only good if the opponent doesn't have many options. In this case, the best move is attacking the king with pawn to b6. By calculating a few moves ahead, you see that the white king has 2 legal moves. The square on d5, which allows the knight on e7 to fork both pieces. The other legal move is c4, which once again allows a fork on e5. In endgames, we also have endgame patterns. Basically, set moves to do that are optimal for a position. Like in this position, if it's white to move, then it's a draw. If it's black to move, then white wins. We call this chess pattern the king and pawn endgame. The white king here wants to promote into a queen and then mate. The black king, on the other hand, wants to end in a stalemate. But let's play the game here. White now has to move. He can't go forward since the king is covering these squares. So, he has to go back. The black king then sees an opportunity, which blocks the pawn and threatens it at the same time. The white king needs to protect it, so they go back and forth. But what if you pushed with the pawn? Well, the king slides into safety, and white really has no choice but to let the black king take the pawn, or to completely block the king's path. Either way, it's a stalemate. But here, if black has to move, it will go in the center, and the white king can just push the pawn. The king will go to the left, and the white king will cover the opposing squares. Then white promotes and wins the game. Either way, these are endgame patterns. You can learn them yourself a bit later. But this is it for now. Chess is a game that needs practice, and hopefully this video gave you a good understanding of how everything works. Chess might be a bit scary in the beginning, and you are going to make a lot of mistakes, but sooner or later, you will realize that you are improving, and things that used to work against you do not seem so scary anymore. Kind of like using coins.